My research report, titled Reframing Womanhood, a rhetorical analysis of Ada James's The Womanly Woman, focuses on the life and work of Wisconsin suffragist Ada James. She is remembered as one of the leading figures in the Wisconsin suffrage movement, whose work helped guide the state of Wisconsin into its historic place in suffrage history as the first state in the nation to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. According to the Wisconsin Historical Society, Ada James was born in Richland Center, Wisconsin in 1876 to prominent community members and early women's rights activists Laura Briggs and David G. James, and these two were instrumental in developing her agency for activism and suffrage early on. Later in life, author Genevieve McBride, in a 2005 book titled Women's Wisconsin, From Native Matriarchies to the New Millennium, states that James is best remembered for her vigorous direction of campaigns for suffrage, her relentless appeals for legislative change, and for her leadership roles within some of the most prominent women's organizations of her time. According to author Karen Manners-Smith in her 2000 publication, New Paths to Power, at the time her speech, The Womanly Woman, was written, gender roles for women in society were changing drastically. Women were pursuing careers, higher education, and joining social and political organizations. It was these club women with whom James would have been most often associated with, and therefore it can be concluded that they would have also been the target audience of her speech. In formulating my research design, I chose to conduct this report as a feminist rhetorical criticism, which is a qualitative method of research. Communications professor Sonia Foss of the University of Colorado, Denver, states in her 2018 article titled Feminist Criticism that when writing a rhetorical criticism, a critic's primary interests are in the strategies used to disrupt hegemonic structures and that provide alternative ways of thinking, acting, and being. Therefore, when composing my research question, I asked, what rhetorical strategies are available to rhetors who want to challenge hegemonic norms? Using this research question to develop the thesis for my paper, I argued that there are 3 rhetorical strategies available to rhetors who want to challenge hegemonic norms. These are known as reframing, implied we, and ethos. Identifying these 3 rhetorical strategies were the research outcomes of my speech and for what I will analyze in greater detail. To conduct my analysis, my method predominantly included examination of archival and primary texts, reference to scholarly articles, and the utilization of online historical databases. In my analysis of her use of language in Ada James's speech, The Womanly Woman, I argued that her goal was to change the meaning of womanhood. The first rhetorical strategy she used is known as reframing, which is defined by Sonia Foss, previously cited, as the process of shifting perspectives and involves the selection and interpretation of a new frame for an experience. In her speech, James states that her intentions are to substitute the dominant view of womanhood at the time with a more wholesome one worthy of emulating. To do so, James reframed the notion of womanhood by offering a new perspective on the traditional roles of mother, homemaker, and wife. An example from her speech includes her reframing of women's role as homemaker. James claimed it was a woman's duty to be responsible for the home in which she lived and the city she lived in. Here, James is extending women's roles beyond the traditional barriers of the home and into ones that demand women's participation in society, both in the political and personal spheres. This was a radical notion for womanhood at the time, and thereby challenged dominant ideals surrounding people's understanding of womanhood. James proposed a relatively evocative perspective on the transformation of the dominant beliefs surrounding womanhood. To ensure that her message was impactful, she needed to persuade her audience of the merits of believing and internalizing her message. To accomplish this, James provided additional support for her claim by utilizing the rhetorical strategies of implied we and ethos. According to authors Stewart, Smith, and Denton in their 2012 publication of Persuasion in Social Movements, the implied we is defined as a subtle means of establishing a feeling of commonality or common ground between the rhetor and the audience. This strategy is effective in blurring the lines of where James was trying to create a relationship with her audience and where she was advancing her own agenda. Examples seen of this in the speech are when James was addressing the need for parental reform. When referring to some of the negative consequences she felt were present in schools in Richland Center, Wisconsin, she referred to these institutions as our schools. Now, whether or not an individual believed that the schools that their children attended also suffered these negative consequences, the use of implied we here transferred the ownership of this belief to her listeners. Finally, to leave lasting impact with her audience, James utilized ethos, or as defined by Foss previously cited, as the appeal of a rhetor's character. This is important because, as stated by authors Crowley and Haughey in their 2004 publication, Ancient Rhetorics for Contemporary Students, an individual's character has as much to do with the audience's perception of their behaviors as it does with their actual behaviors. To engage one's ethos, Rhetor must demonstrate that they are intelligent, are of good moral character, and that they have goodwill towards their audience. James accomplished this by referencing the work she herself participated in that supported the claims of what she was saying a womanly woman was supposed to do. James used the content of her speech as a tool to bolster her credibility and demonstrate her intelligence. In doing so, her audience would be able to reference the specific work she herself had completed as an activist, as well as be able to trust that her character was to be trusted. By doing this, James established her ethos while also redefining womanhood. In conclusion, I conducted a feminist rhetorical criticism of Ada James's speech, The Womanly Woman, and I argue that Ada James used her speech to challenge the dominant norms of womanhood by applying the rhetorical strategies of reframing, the implied we, and ethos. I supported my conclusions by referencing how my argument aligns with those of other communication scholars in the field of rhetorical criticism. For example, research conducted by communications professors Lisa Strange from Penn State University and A. Cherry Carlson of Arizona State both discuss how other suffrage activists during this time would appeal to their audience's traditional values and beliefs while also advancing radical appeals for social change. Finally, in consideration of how the study can be utilized for future research, it is my belief that the rhetorical strategies used during the suffrage movement are deserving of future study for their relevance to social justice work engaged in today. Modern rhetors should consider implementing the methods used by suffrage leaders like Ada James because the suffrage rhetoric serves as a model of success for how to create messages that generate social change. Thank you.